Good evening, everybody. We're going to cover a lot of ground this evening because I overpromised and I'm not going to underdeliver, and we're going to try to get through everything. So we're going to talk about the Alliaceae family with focus on onions, shallots, and leeks. We're going to go through Poaceae, which is the grass family, but specifically we're going to talk about edible grass. So we're going to do corn and various grains, and take a little time because many of us are in communities where corn is grown widely and cross-pollination is a concern. We're going to introduce you to a quick and efficient way of hand-pollinating corn. So, Alliaceae family. Onions and shallots we're going to treat basically interchangeably. There are ways to propagate shallots, especially the French gray shallots, by clonal propagation, by the bulbs like we do with garlic often, but we're talking specifically about shallots that are from seeds. So this is the genus and species Allium cepa. And we're going to focus on leeks as well, but leeks and elephant garlic are cross-compatible. So I just put that in there for those of us who are growing elephant garlic who may have it go to flower one year, just to keep in mind that it cross-compatible with leeks if you decide to do both, which if you do, bless you. Onions and shallots are biennial. Most of what we grow are biennials. There are perennial versions as well, which are multiplier onions or walking onions. So those do perennialize. They are cross-compatible, but generally when we're talking about growing onions or shallots from seed, we're talking about biennials. So again, just a refresher, that's one season of growth for vegetative growth to grow the actual bulb, and then it dries down. It's put in storage for a period of time, which we'll talk about. And then it's planted out after its vernalization period and set out for flowering and producing seed the following year. Seed type is dry. It is a perfect flower, meaning it has all the requisite parts on a single flower to be able to pollinate itself. It is self-fertile, but these are much more leaning towards an outcrossing tendency because they lend themselves well to bees and insects of all types. They're wonderful pollinators. So their primary mechanism is outcrossing, though they are self-compatible. So again, the growing distances are somewhat relative. If you're only growing one type of onion or one type of shallot, it's rare that you'll have a neighbor growing. Those flowers in the ornamental alliums, drumstick alliums, and so forth are not this genus and species. So for the most part, there's not a concern of cross-compatibility there. If you are growing multiple types in the same year, and you have a high level of biodiversity on your farm or garden, which I hope you do, then you want to go towards the higher element there if you can afford it. But if you have a very small garden, I'd recommend just doing one at a time. You want at least 5 for viable seed. Again, that's the absolute minimum just to be able to produce viable seed, because certain varieties of onions and shallots do lean towards self-fertility. You could even get away with producing viable seed from one, but you would have you'd be fast approaching a genetic bottleneck if you were to only save from one. So unless it's the last bulb on earth of the best onion you've ever tasted, I would strongly recommend at least having 5 there for enough viable seed that you can replant with confidence in the following years. For genetic maintenance, at least 100, because they lean towards outcrossing, especially particular species. The more the merrier. We've talked before, for those who are new, about strategies around this. If you have a smaller garden, planting only 25 or 30 at a time, and then introducing seed from older years to re-imbue that genetic diversity going forward. So you're making sure that you're not going like this, little by little by little, and then cutting off opportunities for evolution in the future. So here's a refresher just on root storage and vernalization. So this is a picture of some beautiful pink onions that we've been working on. Hannah is on the call. This is something that she's bred. And you can see that they have dried down. So they're in the field, and this is just like you'd grow an onion traditionally. The stalk dries down or falls over. You bring them inside. You let the stalks get nice and crispy. We tend to trim them up. Roots, as you can see here, are somewhat optional, whether you decide to trim them or not. And then these will keep at room temperature just fine for eating. But if you want to vernalize them to change the energy from vegetal to flowering and seed energy, then you want to keep them in a cold period for at least 10 to 12 weeks. Some varieties of onions and shallots tend to go on the lesser side, like 6 to 8 weeks. But our general standard for all vernalization to cover all bases is 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 12 weeks. That works really well for everything. You can get away with making them even cooler. As you see here, we have 36 to 40 degrees. If you can get them just above the freezing point, if you have a larger cooler or some sort of storage situation where that lends itself to it, then you're just inhibiting sprouting that much more. Sprouting is not a death sentence for onions, but early sprouting onions are something, one, you'd want to select against in storage, and two, you want to try to conserve as much energy as possible in the bulb before you're planting it out the following year. So if you find yourself in the springtime with sprouting onions, that's okay. They can still be planted. They'll still be great. But early sprouting stuff are things you want to cull and periodically check for rotting. And the colder you have it, the less the onion will want to wake up and start sprouting. So after that vernalization period, we're setting them out as early as possible. Onions are and shallots are cold tolerant as bulbs, especially if you mulch them a little bit, but they will not survive a hard frost. So you really want to wait till the danger of frost is fully passed, which for us is usually around, it used to be May 1st, and now we can usually get away with mid to late April, depending on how mild of a season it is, putting those onions out. And maybe we'll get a little dip into the frost, but we won't get a hard freeze like 25 or so. We plant these pretty close together when we've talked about biennials before and replanting roots like carrots and beets and chicories as well. We've said to give them a little extra space. We found that planting onions sort of in 2 rows, if you have about a 36-inch bed that you're working with, and putting them as close as 6 to 8 inches apart, you can get away with these because there aren't a lot of foliar. There's not really foliar growth that's coming up. The onion stalk is a single stalk. It's going straight up. It's easier to be able to stake when they're closer together, and they're not as much space hogs as some of the other ones when they wake up. But staking is crucial. I don't have a picture of it right here, but just to reiterate, we use the Florida weave. So that's just a matter of putting posts every 10 feet or so and wrapping twine, baling twine, tomato twine, something like that around, just so you're giving the stalk some support, because a windstorm can lodge the entire stalk or snap it, even if it's a violent wind. So this is a picture of us, again, culling onions, but it's not as informative as the following picture. This is really what we want to be looking at here. So for the harvest, I'll just say when the stalk changes brown, and the the onion flower on the top starts to turn tannish brown, you want to check for something like this. If you see these wide open like this, they very readily dehiss, meaning they'll fall right out. So you want to catch them when they're in this stage. If you can lean a bucket or a bag over and tap them in as needed, that's completely fine. What we generally do is wait for about 2/3 or so of the onion seed heads to be starting to look like this, and then we gently cut the seed heads and we bring them inside on a window screen or something to dry a little further. Onion and shallot seed and leeks, as well, as we'll see, are very susceptible to moisture. So if you find them more in the phase of what you see sort of in the top right corner or the top left corner of this picture, where the pod itself, the actual fruit of the onion or shallot seed, is fused but brown, that's okay, because if you leave it too long and it goes through a period of rain or excessive moisture, the heads can start to rot. So if you can get it like the black seed we see here, just tap it into a bucket or a bag, that's the best case scenario. If you have to bring them early in to finish ripening, that's okay. Just bring as much of the stalk in, or even the entire plant if you can, to finish ripening. And then that's as easy as breaking it with your hands, just gently rubbing your hands back and forth if they're not already coming out, if you have more of the pods that we're seeing there than the open, accessible black seeds. Some people use a method called floating, which is if you have seeds with a ton of chaff and you're not able to clean them very easily, you can pour the whole mess into a small bucket of water and allow the viable seed to float to the ground, and you can float off the chaff and things that are non-viable. But because the seeds are so small, this has to be done quickly, and it has to be dried really quickly as well, because they're very susceptible to sprouting. So if you want to do a little deeper dive, that's out there in the internet world to check out. But we generally recommend just bringing them in to dry and handling them dry, breaking the chaff up. Very easy to put just in front of a box fan or some sort of small fan. The chaff blows away, seed falls down to the ground. So leeks. Also a biennial, also a dry seed. The seed heads look very similar to onions and shallots. Um, seed flowers are also perfect and self-fertile, favoring insects very heavily, though they can self-pollinate. Similar growing distance, same information here that we saw for the other Allia. The big difference really comes down to the following slide. So when you're preparing leeks for storage, unlike onions and shallots, as many of us know who have grown leeks and left them in the field sometimes to overwinter, they do not dry out in the field. So they're basically ready when we've had some pretty cold nights. The type of leeks that we choose to focus on, just because there's a more generous window, are ones that are listed as winter leeks, which tend to have more blue foliage. They're not fall leeks or quick leeks. Those ones have a much hardier, much more of a cold tolerance. Some of them can even readily winter outdoors in our zone 7 and probably in zone 6 as well, especially with a little bit of snow. But to be a fail-safe, leeks do sweeten, as with many vegetables, their own natural antifreezes to convert their starches to sugar, and they become coveted by rodents and deer alike in the garden. So make sure that you protect them well if you do decide to overwinter them. Selecting for cold hardiness and overwintering is a wonderful attribute, so that's definitely encouraged. But otherwise, we would say bring them inside, similar to how we've stored other roots that we've talked about, which is, in the case of leeks, giving them what's called a fan cut. So if you imagine the top of the leek looking like a spearhead, you're taking 2 cuts. You see the foliage on this picture of a leek. You're going up towards the center point of the leek in both ways. So a lot of that excess leaf is just cut right off. And what you have is the stalk still intact with just a little bit of leaf on the outside. And then you can pull those up, roots and all, and we store them either in moist sawdust or in moist sand, something to keep the roots from desiccating entirely. And then they can be left in a garage or a really cold area, because leeks can take light frosts. It's not as important for them to be in constant refrigeration storage as long as they're in a cold place. And then we've set them back out. They've gone through their vernalization process like we've just talked about with onions and shallots. Same deal. Cut the seed heads when they're tan or brown, dry them on a screen for a couple days, and you're basically done. If they are wide open enough and there's dry weather, that you can tap them into a vessel, that's the ideal, because then they're fully dried in the field and very easy to work with after that, very minimal chaff and pods and so forth to clean up. I think is just what I said here. Yep, same directions as onions and shallots. Some of these slides this week especially will be repetitive. We've duplicated them just for the purpose of releasing the slides along with the finished video when we post things. So if everything sounds the same tonight for certain vegetables, it's intentional. And if I'm going very fast, rest assured that all the information will be there. We're not going to cover garlic. It does come up. It has come up historically. True garlic seed, as some may know on this call, is pretty hard to actually produce. So we're used to taking garlic cloves and planting the cloves and calling it our seed garlic, which is appropriate for its purpose. But actual seed of garlic does not come from the bulb itself. It comes from the garlic flower. And a lot of varieties of garlic, because of the selection process over many years, because of the way they've been handled, because of the tendency of that particular garlic, for one reason or another, the flowers themselves are very hard to open. So they have to, in a lot of cases, be teased open in order for you to get past just the bulbil, so that that flower is accessible to cross-pollinate with other garlic. Otherwise, if you're just saving bulbils from the top, you may think, I have true garlic seed. And what you actually have is still clonally propagated material, just like the garlic cloves themselves. The bulbils can be useful because it's, let's say you have nematode on your garlic, or you have garlic rot, or some sort of seed-borne or insect pathogen contamination on your actual garlic cloves. You can save the bulbils, and they're high and dry above the ground, and you almost certainly don't have to worry about that. It does take a few years for them to get to the same size, planting from the bulbil, to get to the actual garlic bulb size that we're used to with the cloves. But anyway, I use this website on here because these are some folks in the Pacific Northwest who are doing true garlic seed propagation and have, when available, wonderful varieties, new varieties of garlic to share with the world, and they get a little bit into the process there. So that's a nice reference if you are curious about true seed propagation from garlic. Let us move on to corn. This is a beautiful corn. It's a picture Hannah took. I'm assuming it's different types of glass gem population, but it's absolutely beautiful.
Yes, it is.
It is indeed. So corn is an annual. Um, it's considered a dry seed. So if you are saving sweet corn seed, and especially those of you who may have read Richard Scarry books to your children, there is a misinformed section on saving sweet corn seed that needs no introduction here. But basically, sweet corn seed needs to dry too. It is a dry seed. If you save a kernel of sweet corn for eating, you will be very disappointed. The flower type is monoecious. So like we talked about before, instead of having a perfect flower structure, it has everything it needs on the corn plant, but it has two separate parts, the tassel on the top, which has the pollen, and then the corn shoot, which eventually becomes the ear of corn. So that's basically the ovary with the stigmas, the shoots, the silk sticking out, waiting to receive pollen on top of them. Even though it has the requisite parts to do its thing as one plant, corn is one of the most susceptible cultivated crops to inbreeding depression. You really want to have a high population, or you want to have some way to imbue fresh genetics regularly. So I'll use this example again that I used earlier in the class about holiday seed saving up in Industry, Maine with master seed saver Will Bonsall, where around that time, everybody was growing a postage stamp sized garden of the same flint corn that was sort of reveled in that area, but nobody had the space to grow 200 plants a year as corn. And so everybody would grow in their small postage stamp garden. And around the holiday season, they would make their rounds, and there would be two bowls. One would be to be a bowl where you would take some of the host's corn to bring home, and the other would be a bowl where you would deposit some of your corn. And by making their rounds and everybody growing a little bit, they were able to keep the genetic diversity of this corn vigorous enough that it lasts for generations. So don't be discouraged by high numbers, is my point. And if it's a precious corn and you only have 20 or 30 seeds, grow it and then just save as much of that as you possibly can. It does not mean that it's doomed. It just means that if you save one ear from one corn plant from a garden that has 1 to 5 corn stalks, every single year after a few years, you're going to have a really sad corn, because that corn will be starting to revert to what's called inbreeding depression. So keep it high in terms of population. We have, again, 800 feet to a half mile for isolation distance. If you're in areas where, especially agricultural, rural areas where high acreage of other types of corn are being grown, then you definitely want to go on the higher side of this, even up to a mile. Now, corn pollen is heavier than other pollen that can be wind transferred, like we discussed with spinach and beets, but it still can travel quite a bit if there are no wind breaks or the prevailing wind is not in your favor. So that's why we're going to learn how to hand pollinate here. So if you are going to endeavor, at least start with about 10 plants just to get viable seed if you must, and figure out some wonderful strategy to keep that genetic maintenance high. And again, just to review what backcrossing is in this context, backcrossing is both a breeding technique and a way of saying, I have corn seed from 2025, and I'm growing that for 2026. And I'm saving seed from my 2026 for planting in 2027. And when I do that, I'm also going to take some of my 2025 seed, and I'm going to plant that and my 2027 seed, so that I'm keeping some of that older genetics in there, and I'm not losing that as I keep a small population. So that's a way to maintain a smaller population if you don't have the space and still keep the genetic diversity high. And there are other strategies online too that are more intelligent than that you can find. So this is a book called The Seed Garden, and there is a wonderful illustration here that we do not have legal consent to publish, so I didn't put it in the slides. We don't have a good slide here for the visualization, so you're just going to have to, in your mind's eye, sort of travel here as we go through these steps. But what you do see pictures of here are two types of bags. The top bag is what's known as a shoot bag, and the bottom bag is a tassel bag. The bottom is a larger bag, and each goes on the name that it is given. So your first step when you're thinking about hand pollinating corn is to walk your corn patch, and you'll start to see tassels emerge from the top of the corn plant. Once those tassels emerge, the shoots that are on sort of the notches between the leaf and the stalk of the corn are also starting to emerge. And so you want to start scouting around for shoots when you see those tassels starting to rise up. That's the first step. Then you'll find those shoots somewhere in those little notches. And sometimes there's a big leaf that's in the way, so you can cut that leaf back out of your way to get at that middle shoot. And you want to take the bag on the top, which is called the shoot bag, and you want to get that shoot bag over your emerging shoot. The shoot will be, only about this big. It won't be showing silks or anything like that, but it'll just start to be pushing its way through. And so cut any foliage around it if needed. Just make sure that that bag can sit squarely on top of your shoot without it blowing away. Now that shoot bag stays covered and you're waiting a couple days, maybe longer, and then you'll notice your tassels start to shed pollen. They will shed pollen over a period of several days. So there's not an immediate rush, but as soon as you're seeing that pollen, that's when you want to grab your tassel bags. And you want to bag the tassels of the plants that you want the pollen from. Ideally, you want to collect pollen from multiple plants, especially if you want to, in a perfect world, pollinate multiple shoots with multiple tassels. So take pollen from a couple different tassels, bag a couple different shoots or more, and then take a little pollen from each tassel. You can either mix the tassel bags up when we get to that step or hold them in separate bags, depending on what your seed saving or breeding desires are. And you want to share that pollen, a little bit of each tassel pollen with each shoot individually. If that makes sense. And so you've bagged your tassels, the shoots are bagged, they're growing inside. Let's say it's the afternoon before you're ready for your hand pollination experiment. And your tassel bags are on, and you secure them either with staples or paper clips, just a way of keeping the bigger bags of the tassels from blowing off for the next morning. And also because you're going to trap pollen in there. After you covered your tassels, we're going to go to our shoot bags and we're going to lift the shoot bags up and give them just a little trim, like about a half inch to an inch off the top of the shoot itself. Then you'll be left with sort of a green circle, and you'll see inside there are some green silks that want to come out. And in fact, by tomorrow morning, they will come out. So you're basically just cutting that shoot bag, you're cutting that shoot that you've had in the shoot bag open. It's been covered so you know that nothing has got on the silk so far. And if you don't see silks especially, you want to cut a little more till you've opened up that very top inch or so and you've exposed where the shoots are. Then you put that shoot bag right back on. Then you go home, or you go to bed, or you go to wherever you need to go until the next morning. Next morning, you come out and first you collect all the tassel bags. So one by one, you sort of tilt these over, give them a few taps. Remember that you're shedding pollen into them, so you don't want to tilt them back over or else you're going to lose your pollen. Take off your paper clips or whatever you've secured them, staples, pull the staples out. Now you have a bag of pollen. Then you go over to your shoot bags and you pull off the shoot bag and you will see this little moppy silk patch that has emerged beyond where you've just cut. And you take your tassel bag or bags and you sprinkle a little bit of pollen on all those silks and cover it right back up before any wind blows anything else on it. And you've just hand pollinated corn. It's as easy as that. Again, a reminder, as we talked about with hand pollination of squash, make sure that you flag which shoot you just hand pollinated, because by the time they're dry, you will have no idea. You will completely lose it. So some flagging tape, bright colored pink or red flagging tape, ribbon, anything that's colored that is easy to find the patch that's not green or brown, basically. That's how you're going to mark your corn ear. And then you can be sure when you save seeds from that ear of corn that it has not received pollen from anywhere but where you intended it to be. Near our farm, we're surrounded on 2 to 3 sides per year with genetically engineered silage corn. So that is a corn that, just while we're on the subject, looks different enough from the flint corns that we're saving that you can often notice in the first year, if not the first year, then the second year, that pollen has come in from a foreign source. So like we've talked about with squash, if the squash gets cross-pollinated, you save the seed, it looks the same inside. You don't find out till the following year that that squash was cross-pollinated. Oftentimes with corn, especially when they look different from one another, if foreign pollen has been transmitted to the corn during pollination, you can open that ear of corn and you'll have this beautiful flint corn. And then, one corn kernel or several corn kernels will be bright yellow and somewhat dented. And that tells us that there was cross-contamination. So it's really, the hand pollination is wonderful if you have a breeding project, like you want to cross two varieties of corn and make your own new variety of corn, or you want to hone in on a particular variety of corn, but it's really only necessary if you're not doing a particular breeding project, if you have concerns of neighbors growing corn. Harvesting is pretty straightforward unless you've only harvested sweet corn before. But if you look at this picture closely, you can see in the bottom center, there's a pile of tan husks. So this is Narragansett corn, also known as Rhode Island white-cap flint corn, that's been grown in our area for thousands of years. And you can see that some of those stalks in there are not all the way brown. So with some varieties of corn, the entire patch will be completely brown, and you'll know all the ears are nice and dry in there. It's been perfectly dry. All the weather's cooperated. Life is good. Other times you'll have varieties of corn like this where things are ripening indeterminately. So some of those stalks are tan or brown and have tan or brown husks on them. Some of them are still green or red stalked and have tan or brown husks on them. So this one requires more regular monitoring. So this ripens over a period of several weeks as opposed to others that might ripen in a tighter window depending on what corn you're saving seed from. But basically, you're looking for a brown or tan husk on your corn, and you can snap that right off the plant. We found that it's best to shuck in the field because it gives you time to both examine what is happening inside that husk, and it can also help you scout for corn earworm or other borers that might be doing a number on your seeds inside that husk until you open it up and realize they've compromised some of the seed in there. So in a perfect world, if you're in a rush and it's about to rain, you just break them off and throw them somewhere and dry them. That's completely fine. But we found it when time allows and space allows to shuck them in the field to get a good look at what the corn is doing. And maybe you don't need to look at the corn as much, but as we saw in that picture of the glass gem corn, there's so much going on in here that if you're saving seeds with a particular idea in mind, or only of certain colors, or making sure that colors are well represented in this case, and there's that diversity there, you want to be able to see what you're saving, which you can do outside of storage too, if you do husk later on. But I've just found that shucking basically in the field is the cleanest way to deal with it, and it eliminates insect problems and helps you really hone in on your selection and eat the rest and not be saving a bunch of corn to cull through later. So this is a very lo-fi old machine that's actually a reissue that we've put onto a box here. This is a corn sheller. You don't need to have a sheller to shell corn, but it's much gentler on the hands. Certain things these shellers handle better than others. So flint corns, the really hard kerneled corns, do very well in these. Others like sweet corn, not so well. So they can tend to split or break corn. So if you only have a few ears of corn that you're doing and you're not processing pounds and pounds and pounds of it for seed, you can use any kind of rubber gloves, or there are some that are like what's called dipped gloves. So they're work gloves that have like a grippy rubber side to them. Those are great because they save your hands a lot of blistering depending on how much the corn wants to let go or not. And you can basically just twist it back and forth, and corn seeds fall right into whatever vessel you have there. It's important to mention here, again, I think I had it in a previous slide, corn really wants to be dry when you shell it. If corn has excessive humidity in it, even if it looks like it's dry to the touch, it's going to want to stick to that cob even harder, and it's going to be much more cumbersome to deal with in storage. So make sure they're really well dried. You can use humidity strips that we've talked about before to monitor that, or a dehumidifier, room with a dehumidifier, something like that, or use the shatter test, which is to take one with a small hammer and just hit the kernel. And if it shatters into pieces, then it's sufficiently dry. If it squishes or bends, then it is not dry enough to either be put in storage or to shell. So now we're going to move on to wheat. And as you'll notice, the wheat and barley slides are pretty much interchangeable with just a little terminology on the barley section. So if I blaze through them, just understand that we're following a similar pattern here. Winter rye, we're going to make an exception with because rye is different in terms of its needs. And it also is sort of the extreme end of what we're going to talk about when we get into grains in general: spring, fall, winter, facultative grains. But all these grains are annuals. They're all dry seed. Indehiscent, meaning they don't separate, they don't explode off the seed head when they're ripe, which is an advantage for gathering. And if you trace this back millennia from the wild forms upon which they were domesticated, there almost certainly was an agreement and a coevolution between humans and plants at some point, where all the ones that didn't shatter in the field were the ones that humans collected early on during the cultivation of wheat. The sort of co-evolutionary pact that we signed, because those other ones would have fallen to the ground by then. So there was an early advantage. It's speculated, that there was an early advantage to having it not shatter. And so we have wheat, by and large, that does not shatter. So wheat and barley are very strong self-pollinators. This is a really good one if you have small space. You may not have enough space to grow your flour and bread making needs for an entire season, but you absolutely have enough space to grow even 5 grain plants. And just for some context here, why it's so important to save grain, even if you're not having enough quantity to eat every single year, is that a majority of the world's caloric intake from wheat and other grains is reliant upon a very small genetic breadth, very few varieties, maybe 3 varieties total. Durum wheat, semolina wheat, and soft white wheat. So that means that if, let's say, a rust epidemic comes and affects the bread baskets of the world, which has happened, that can sweep through so much of the genetic diversity, that's the lack of genetic diversity that is in the wheat fields that grow most of the world's wheat, that there's an absolute need to preserve as much, especially what's called ancient grains, but older varieties of grains as possible. And a lot of these varieties that we still have are thanks to one single farmer or a handful of efforts of gardeners or those who have been maintaining land races for in situ for hundreds of years or longer. So we really need more diversity in grains, and it's a very incredible service you'll be performing for future generations to just focus on saving them for seed, even if they don't fit into your pantry regimen at this point. And they're so easy. So there are folks who offer what's called gene pools, so wide, diverse arrays of different wheats, all kind of selected together, which can sometimes cross with one another. But the beauty about these wider gene pools and older varieties in general that have more diversity is that if you see one beautiful stalk sticking up out of your 20 or 200 wheat that looks totally different, that's vigorous, that's not falling over, that's ripe beautifully, you can save seed from that and reliably have, in most cases, a stabilized new variety of wheat, because they tend so much towards self-pollination. So it's a really easy one to save seed from, and it's a really important one as well to do selection work from. So we have some definitions down here towards the bottom. So you can see winter wheat is one extreme. And even though these are technically annuals, they do require a period of vernalization to effectively set flowers, pollinate, and do seed. So these are most often sown in the fall time. And because they're also winter hardy, they can sprout and last the entire winter, either bare or covered with snow. And then they've gone through their vernalization period, and they have a great head start on weed pressure, which is a big concern for those growing organic grains on larger scales. So we really like winter varieties, as they're called, for this reason, because we can start them in the fall and they're way ahead. Otherwise, you're depending on a dry enough spring to get in as early as possible, because grain seed can germinate at a lower temperature than most other garden vegetables, but you're still waiting for the conditions to be right to enter your garden or your farm space to sow the grains. So just a word of advice, we really like the winter varieties. But then it depends on your culinary preferences or what aesthetics you're drawn to. So spring wheats are the other side. They don't require any vernalization, and some are actually cold hardy. So you could treat them, depending on the variety, like they were a winter wheat. So even though they don't require the vernalization, you can still sow them in the fall. And if they are a cold hardy variety that is tried and true, that you've had experience with, or someone who's sharing the seed or some seed company attests to, then you could treat them like this and have them overwinter and be ahead of the weeds in the spring. There's also a category which is obviously broad and loose and atmospheric, or sort of amorphous, called facultative. And facultative means somewhere in between. A great example of this is einkorn, which those who have explored grain alternatives with gluten intolerances may be well familiar with. It's an absolutely wonderful grain. It is, along with emmer, which you see in front of us here in this picture, and spelt, the oldest varieties of wheat, ancient grains under cultivation. Probably also with teff, although that's a different genus and species. That's one that has been largely unchanged for millennia, and it has a very weak gluten structure in it, which makes it more nuanced to bake with, but also makes it much more easily digestible for those who are not on the extreme celiac end of things. And einkorn is a beautiful example of a facultative grain. So what is a facultative grain? That means that some of the population or the population itself can either be grown in the spring or the fall. So I've seen a population of einkorn that has sprouted in the spring and not had vernalization, and some of it pollinated and produced seed, and some of it didn't. I've seen einkorn, another strain, where we've planted it in the fall and 2/3 of it dies, and the other third vernalized and overwintered wonderfully. So a facultative grain means it's somewhere in the middle, and if you are going to take on one of these ancient grains, it's important to try them in different pockets. So try them in the fall and have a backup for spring if fall doesn't work. Harvesting grains, very easy, very straightforward. Here's a very easy identifiable spikelet here. It turns tan. The seeds on the inside will be past what's called the milk stage. So if you were to pull one of the seeds out and squeeze it, it would be starchy on the inside. It would not squeeze and secrete like a milky ooze. As long as there's milk in there, even if it looks like it's a little harder and it's starting to dry down, then the seed is not yet botanically mature. And unless you pull the entire plant with its roots on and put it in storage, it's almost certainly likely that you will not get viable seed from it. So make sure that kernel is nice and hard. And once you've harvested it, you want to make sure that the grain is, like we say here, doesn't dent at the press of a fingernail. There's a little window where the grain can be botanically mature and still have a little indentation with a fingernail press. It's not fully hard. But unless it were an extreme example where floods were coming or you had to pull this out or birds were eating it, just wait till it's so hard in the field that you can stick your fingernail on it, it's not milking, and there's no little indentation from your fingernail. Then you know for sure it's fully dry and ready to be processed. What you see on the right here is not easily identifiable. These are pictures from a machine that a wonderful friend of ours built. There's a website called farmhack.org. And it is, for those who do not know it, a platform for farmers to share all types of open source plans for farm machinery or ideas that they've had for solving wash station problems on their farm, whatever. It's a wonderful resource to check out. And on there, our friend who constructed this barrel drum thresher also put the plans and the drawings. So you can look at it online and with a little construction knowledge, be able to build one yourself. It speeds up the time that you would otherwise be having a dance party on a tarp. So when we're doing bigger lots of grain, it's a nice way to be able to throw them in. And those hammers that you see in there are those flails, those wooden planks with metal around them, wire metal around them, are doing the job that either a stick or a foot would do. So if you don't have this machine and you're not in proximity to us to come use ours, then you can put your grain on a tarp, fold the tarp over, and either whack it with a stick a bunch of times or invite some friends over for a dance party and twist and shout all over it. And these will readily separate from the chaff there. And because the grains of wheat and barley and all the ancient grains, einkorn and emmer and so forth, are so much larger and heavier than the chaff, they're very easy to winnow with a box fan. So screens could be useful if you have a lot of pieces of stalk or small rocks that got pulled in if you brought the whole plants. But otherwise, just a box fan to winnow this. It cleans up beautifully. And then we use our shatter test, just like we were talking about with corn. Hit it with a hammer. If it breaks open into pieces, then it's ready to be stored. So barley is pretty much identical to wheat in terms of seed saving, in terms of the winter barley, spring barley, some facultative barleys. But here's just some extra terminology as you're going through just to help discern what the barley is that you're getting or what you want to do with it. So winter, spring barley, there are two types of barley, generally speaking. There's 2-row barley and 6-row barley. 2-row barley has, surprise, 2 rows, and 6 has 6 rows. 6 will be greater yielding per plant, depending on how many tillers it's putting out. There are 2 rows that are hardier and may put out enough tillers to be able to produce as much or more as a 6-row. So really just get to know a barley and decide there's no advantage or disadvantage to having 2-row or 6-row. I found, and this is anecdotal, but I found that there's oftentimes a good barley is a good barley and there's not necessarily a higher yield just because there are more rows. There are types of hulled barley, hull-less barley, meaning when the barley is ripe and ready, it separates from its little container, its little hull around it very readily and easily. But a lot of barley is also hulled barley, which means there's an extra step in the cleaning process where you have to dehull. That can be as easy as rubber gloves and agitating with your hands over and over again, all the way up to the same friend who constructed that drum thresher that you saw previously also just took a corn flour mill and put some hospital grade latex on one side so that as barley seed, or in this case, brown rice seed that was hulled, coming down, they're agitated without being crushed. So any way to just sort of agitate to get that hull off, it's just one extra step. But hulled barley often, not always, but often is hardier and more disease resistant than the hull types that I've had experience with, which is not super comprehensive, but there's no reason to issue hulled barley just because there's an extra step. It's not that big of a deal. What you see in this set of hands here is what's known as bearded barley. So those really spiky awns sticking up are what's known as a beard. So beards often require some sort of removal. It's extra chaff to deal with, but again, not a big deal. There are some barleys that are unbearded, which I have not worked much with. Basically, they're either smaller spikelets on there, or they're just not on there much at all. This is an example of a hulless barley. This is a purple barley called Tibetan hulless, which is a very small plant, but the mature barley is purple, kind of purplish brown. It's absolutely wonderful. It's very easy to grow and clean. So this is an example of a hulless barley, which you can see does not have a monstrous beard on it too. It's a very unintimidating and gentle beard, a short trim. Barley, just like wheat, annual, perfect, self-compatible. It's almost exclusively a selfer, although they can cross. Crossing happens very close range if it happens much at all. So, this is, again, in terms of grains, you can grow multiple types 10 to 20 feet away from each other and almost certainly have pure varieties by doing so. This is an example of a bearded barley that is starting to dry down here. I think I've said everything on this slide already. Long-term maintenance, the 50 plus for genetic maintenance is especially important with ancient grains or wider populations. If you're saving one, let's say like a hard red winter wheat, there are a couple of varieties that are readily available. Those still have enough diversity in them, but they're not so variable that saving only 10 plants or 20 plants is going to cut significantly into their genetic variation. And unlike corn, these varieties are not nearly as susceptible to inbreeding depression. So it's really on the larger scale as much as you can fit in your garden or farm. But if you can't fit 50 of grain, you can still do 10 to 20. And if it's a variety that's been more cultivated, more domesticated, then you're pretty reliably saving enough genetics to carry it on for a good bit of time. Same harvesting requirements as wheat that we've talked about here. So I'm going to keep going through. Same situation. Box pen. Chatter test. So on to winter rye. The reason I'm bringing up rye here, annual ryegrass, winter rye, they are all similar to one another, but there is a perennial rye, which is a different genus and species. The perennial rye is not cross-compatible with annual rye or winter rye. We focused on winter rye here because it requires vernalization, and it's also very widely used as cover crop for folks in farms and gardens. So that's a really nice one to focus on because winter rye grows very well in our climate. You'll notice here, winter rye and many types of rye are typically not compatible with themselves. Rye needs a larger population. It is wind pollinated. So unlike the other grains, even though winter rye may look somewhat similar in grain form, it needs a larger population and it needs wind help to produce viable seed. So hence a larger isolation distance. The isolation distance here is 750 feet, which is more than ample if somebody's growing a cover crop nearby. It's unlikely that because it's wind pollinated and it's close to itself that rye pollen will travel very, very far. But if you do have a neighbor growing some generic variety of winter rye, or you're growing multiple types of winter rye, which praise be to you if you are, give them a larger isolation distance than we've talked about. And at least 5 for viable seed because they're typically self-incompatible. Unlike one, if you grow one wheat plant, you will have viable seed. Processing is just the same as we talked about for winter, for wheat of all type and barley. Processing and storage, also the same. So we've covered all this ground by 7:01 p.m. Congratulations for the marathon. Next week will be our last week. We're covering brassicas, which we love to save for last. I would not say they're the best because we don't like to choose children here, but there's so much to say about brassicas. They're absolutely wonderful. And there's a lot of variation and sort of nuances and techniques between different species of brassicas. So we'll spend the entire hour just doing brassicas next week. Thanks everybody for coming. Hope you have a great evening and everybody stays healthy and safe and takes care of one another. We'll see you next week.